Housing has become the frontline defense against the coronavirus in order to prevent the spread of the COVID-19. Countries across the world are asking and in some cases legislating that people must stay home. This is based on the assumption that one's home provides a protection against contracting and spreading the virus. Over 4 million South Africans live in informal settlements. Dr. Justin Visagie, a research specialist in the Department of Inclusive Economic Development at the Human Sciences Research Council, joins us now via Zoom to talk about this issue. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Visagie. Thank you so much for joining us here on the SABC News channel.
Thanks for having me on the show, Balesa.
Now, the document sort of stresses that the restructuring of informal settlements should have been introduced with immediate effect. Talk to us about that.
Yes, it's really significant that in the ANC's new economic plan, that in the section on human settlements, reblocking is one of the three items explicitly mentioned. And what reblocking essentially means is how do you spatially reconfigure the profile of informal settlements. And this is really important because it represents a shift from a reactive approach to a more proactive and long-term strategy. And this is probably because of the reality of COVID and the fact that trying to limit the spread of disease in an informal settlement where social distancing or physical distancing is near impossible. But it's actually it has implications far beyond just the spread of disease. In fact, the shape or the lack of space in informal settlements really prevents government putting in infrastructure to provide basic services. It leads to congestion. Also in the winter now, the spread of firefighters can't get in there to fight fires. So the spatial structure of informal settlements essentially keeps them more or less as they are. And so, yes, government can come and provide some electrification or some water, but you're not really doing anything in the long term. And so what reblocking means is you take advantage of the impermanence of most of these are shack structures to actually, from the bottom up, plan with communities as how can we get in a pathway, and then along the pathway install infrastructure and services. So essentially, once you've got that service grid in place, over time, that settlement can start to look more and more like something that could be here for the long term.
And we do know, of course, that these dense informal settlements also pose an extreme risk, more so to the spread and the control of COVID-19. So the standard protocols, for example, of physical social distancing are almost impossible for people who are living in those small shacks who at the same time have to share water, they have to share ablution facilities with their neighbors in communities. So how do we go about remedying this situation?
Yes, I mean, as you say, it's really difficult practically to limit the spread of disease, and not just COVID-19. In world history, in fact, many of the modern developed cities today, like London or Paris, they had their slums back in the day, and there were huge outbreaks of disease back there too. And so it is about public investment because space is a limited resource in cities, but if you put the right investment alongside with that space, you can actually manage it appropriately. And so in terms of real estate, some of the most dense places in the world are actually some of the most valuable. You just have to look at the skyscrapers in Manhattan Island to understand that. So part of the issue is this lack of space and public investment in informal settlements to properly manage the densities. In fact, if you're living in an informal settlement in South Africa, you're as dense as somewhere like Hillbrow in South Africa, in Johannesburg, with the difference that everyone's on the ground floor. And so it needs to start with looking at the shape and the structure, that it can't be haphazard. There needs to be a sort of a grid in place where government can start to install services. And that's what reblocking is about. Our own research in eThekwini is looking at actually how we can build upwards in informal settlements. And what this means is not necessarily building skyscrapers, because that's just completely impractical. Government doesn't have the resources. But you can, through empowering communities with more local know-how to start to put in place much safer structures that are actually durable and can provide a much better long-term solution. So what we're looking at is the community getting together, replanning the structure, how they can put in place courtyards, streetways, etc., and then with the support of government and other NGOs and civil society groups, how they can build safe and sustainable structures that provide a little bit more space. And I think that's part of the challenge here, is that we need to change our mindset that informal settlements are here to stay, and therefore we need to find sustainable ways to invest in them moving forward.
Talking about changing mindsets, the reality is there are no easy answers to the shortage of land in dense informal settlements. So the possibility to de-densify some of these settlements, it can either be through relocations or the likes, were originally raised by the Department of Human Settlements at the onset of this COVID-19 crisis. And we've seen rejection really by a coalition of practitioners and some civil society groups citing that these may have a negative social, economic, as well as political consequences. Your take on that?
Yes, civil society have come out quite strongly to say that trying to de-densify informal settlements is just not practical. And in fact, the United Nations, UN Habitat have said the same, have the same view. And I suppose it's on two fronts. The one is that if you relocate people, you're taking them away from the social networks and the structures that support them, and they're very vulnerable. And so it's a moral and humanitarian issue, but also practically from experience, where South Africa has tried to de-densify or relocate households out of informal settlements, there's been a very poor track record. And along with that is the places that you de-densify invariably get filled up again. So in some ways it might seem like a solution to move people, but practically it's not feasible. And a much better approach is rather to work with the community, where you get their buy-in from the ground up to say, well, how can we restructure things so that there is the space? So for example, if you create the space for a pathway that runs down the informal settlement, you could then put in a sewer pipe and a water reticulation network. And the government might not have the money to put in all the infrastructure at once, but once you've got that basic frame in place, by looking at the spatial configuration, over time you could add more and more services, and the community could give their buy-in if in return they're getting secure tenure, a little bit more certainty, and they're getting practical support in terms of the services that government offer. Our own research suggests that people are even willing to pay for these services. Of course, people are very poor, but they do have some level of resources. So it's about building a social compact, and it needs to be from the bottom up. But I think that it's, as I've said, informal settlements are here to stay. So it's an opportunity that we have, even though we're reacting to COVID-19, to realize that we need to sort out living conditions in informal settlements. And this is an important task for the long term, not just the here and now.
And I suppose the availability of land remains a major challenge as to how government can strike a balance between finding that land for residential as well as some commercial use. Time constraints, I'm afraid we have to leave it at that, Dr. Visagie. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thanks very much.